Good morning to our friends in Europe. Good afternoon and good evening to our friends in Asia. I am Tricia Pioctaviano from the Governance and Economy team of the Asia-Europe Foundation. Welcome to the culminating activity of our month-long launch event for the ASEF Public Diplomacy Handbook 2nd edition, Communicating with Purpose and Value, through the ASEF PPT lecture series and peer-to-peer program. The webinar extends and elevates the discourse in the handbook's final chapter. You can download the handbook for free. You just have to visit www.asef.org. Today's webinar is about dangers and annoyances and opportunities, the contemporary communications environment. Joining us in this conversation are two distinguished panelists, Dr. Damien Spry and Dr. James Pammen. Please allow me to briefly introduce them. Dr. Damien Spry is a lecturer in media and communications at the University of South Australia. His research focuses on digital influence campaigns in international contexts, including digital diplomacy, strategic communications, and inference campaigns, and the impact of information disorder, which includes misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation on international relations. And Dr. James Pammen, he's Associate Professor in Strategic Communication at Lund University, Sweden, and Editor-in-Chief of the journal Place Branding and Public Diplomacy. His research focuses on how states influence one another using strategic communication. He has consulted and trained for a variety of countries, international organizations, and businesses. He was a non-resident fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This panel will be moderated by Ms. Stacy Danica Garcia, who is an alumna of the ASEF Public Diplomacy Training Program. Throughout most of Ms. Garcia's career in the Foreign Service, she has been actively involved in public diplomacy. This year, she served as guest lecturer on digital public diplomacy with Diplom Foundation, which is a longtime partner of ASEF PBT. Following her assignment in London, she's back in Manila as acting director at the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs Office of the United Nations and other international organizations. Stacy, I give you the floor now, and let's start this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia, and I'm thrilled to moderate this afternoon's panel discussion. We're expecting to have a very interesting discussion this afternoon, considering that we will be talking about the new and emerging challenges that public diplomacy practitioners face in this new communications landscape. Let's begin with our first question. Damien and James, we're very interested to know, how has the media and communications landscape changed over the past decade? And what do you think are the main factors driving these changes? How do you also think that these changes have affected public diplomacy? Maybe Damien can go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Daisy. Hello, everyone, and welcome from South Australia, where it's early evening. Welcome to the basement of my house. But to your question, look, there's been dramatic changes over the last 20 years, mostly associated with two, let's call them devices, pieces of technology, one being the smartphone, the other one being the internet. Some of the participants here may not have been around long enough to remember a time when everyone didn't carry mobile phones around, but they've dramatically changed the way that people communicate with one another, and including, therefore, how digital diplomacy operates. Ubiquity, let's just use that word, and meaning everywhere, all the time, at any kind of place, any kind of time or day, people are connecting. People are also able to participate and able to contribute. In other words, that because of these devices, the barriers to entry that were previously around because people didn't have the technology, they didn't work for a media organization, or let alone a Ministry for Foreign Affairs, weren't able to easily participate in that conversation. Now anyone can at any time. So what that means is there's a lot more communicating going on. One of the consequences of that is that in the past, where we might have thought that information is valuable because it's scarce, information isn't scarce anymore. What's scarce is attention. So that makes it difficult to get a message out there, even if you've got a great message, because there are a lot of other people trying to get messages out at the same time. And in my research, I've found that one of the greatest difficulties that people who are working for embassies or consulates or ministries of foreign affairs they face is that they're just competing with a lot more people who have similar things to say or radically different messages to offer. So getting attention is really, really tricky now. A couple other things that have come out of the internet that are seemingly contradictory. One thing is searchability. So you would be very familiar with the idea that it's, if you want to find something, you can search for it. That's new and it's different because you can search the whole world's worth of information. On the flip side of that, narratives and conversations and even campaigns can be hidden. I'm talking about campaigns that operate within closed groups, closed networks of communications, either that's in messaging services or in Facebook groups or those sorts of things. And that can be a problem if you're seeking to debunk information or to address groups who are participating in movements or have messages which require your attention and require to be addressed. And if you can't see what's going on, you can't act against it. And the last one, and then I'll hand over to James for a bit, is this idea of the algorithmic curation of content. So you're probably all familiar with the fact that your social media feeds and your search results are determined by complex computer programs which take into account information about you, which means that everyone's social media feed and everyone's search results are personalized to them. Which means that everyone's getting a slightly different view of the world depending upon what that algorithm determines. The other thing about these algorithms is, of course, they're designed not to just operate for the benefit of the people who are searching or who are using social media, but for the benefit of those companies and their clients who are the advertisers who are using them. So they're designed to keep us engaged. They're designed to encourage us to use these platforms more, to stay on for longer periods of time. And they're also designed to help target us for people who are trying to influence us in one way or another. Most typically that's advertising, but it also could be political communication. Now, the significance of that for people who are working in diplomacy or international political communication more generally is that it's possible to target specific people with specific messages at specific times for specific purposes. And to do that at scale, at pretty low cost, and to do it repeatedly. So there can be experiments going on to see which messages are most effective. I think I've talked quite a lot there about a whole bunch of changes that have come along. I'll switch over to James and then maybe we can have a chat about it.
Right, wonderful. Thank you, Damien. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. I think Damien set out the big issues really well. So what I'll do is dive into three slightly more nuanced areas that build on the kind of bigger context that Damien set out. The first big change at this kind of lower level down is the new ability to analyze what's happening in public debates. So it very much builds on this context that Damien just laid out, but within that are then it's like a new toolbox where you can dig into what's happening and find out how is information spreading? How's it being distributed? What are people responding to? What makes them angry? What makes them happy? What makes them sad? Who are the hubs and influencers to people who, if you get the message to them and they decide to pass the message on, can they become kind of key hubs in a network? You can study how the network gets built. And I think it's quite a big difference from how things were in the old days when you were reliant on newspapers and television only. So this digital environment gives you a whole new way of analyzing audiences, a whole new way of analyzing how information circulates. And that in itself offers then a whole new range of tools in how to hone your messages and better target them. The second thing is that for every new tool, the smartphone, the computers, Twitter, Facebook, whatever kind of tool you're talking about, people are still people, right? And that means they're committed to finding out how far you can push these tools to suit their own interests. And that often means exploiting the tool to its absolute maximum. So what we've really seen in the last 10 years is the kind of marginal technological exploitation of new tools, where the majority of the population understands a little bit how they work. They can use them. They can go on Facebook. They can make posts. They know how to use images and films, know how to comment, but they perhaps don't know about some of the cutting edge exploitations that you can do using these same basic principles. So I think a really good example of that has been bots, probably not so much now, but maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, even 10 years ago. Bots are small pieces of code on Twitter that automate certain behaviors. So you can ask a bot, you can create a piece of software that will track the weather, and every time there's an update on the day's weather, it will then automatically tweet for you saying, this is what the weather will be tomorrow. And you can automate that for sports news, for any kind of current affairs that you're interested in. But then obviously people use that, and they figured out that we can also exploit that to build audiences to achieve propaganda goals. And I think there was a general lack of understanding that these kind of tools can be exploited, and that they will be exploited because they can, because that's how people are. That's what people do with tools. So I think that's kind of the second big impact on public diplomacy. And then the third is that we often think of media systems as national, and obviously social media made these media systems more transnational and more interrelated. I think what we didn't expect was how different groups within different countries would really exploit these interconnections. So, for example, a marginal political group in Sweden might look to build contacts in Germany, and then that information might make it to the US or somewhere else in the world, and then be imported back into Sweden. And then within Swedish national debate, people will say, look at what the Canadians are saying about us, look at what the Germans are saying about us. And this has become like a really key tool of exploiting interconnectedness. And I think, we didn't particularly expect it to happen to the extent that it's happening, but it's really giving that a set of tools for marginal political groups in different countries to express themselves. And I think that's a really important one for public diplomacy, because it does show that whatever you're saying in one country can very easily be exported to other markets and then find its way back in that original market, twisted, turned around, used for different goals, and that's actually very difficult to counteract, because it's really about it's really a form of exploitation between markets that might have different rules, different conditions, different norms. But if you can find ways of exploiting that, it's creating very unpredictable outcomes.
Now that's very interesting, Damien and James, because on one hand, as what Damien mentioned a while ago, attention is rapidly becoming a very important currency in today's communication landscape. While on the other hand, we have an influx of new and emerging technology that have practically made borders irrelevant. So you very well described the risks and the threats that come with these changes. Now we'd also like to know, what opportunities can public diplomacy practitioners seize from these developments?
This idea of utilizing these tools for digital diplomacy, I think before I go into some of the things that can be done, I want to kind of give everyone who's listening a lesson in just saying no sometimes to every idea that comes across your desk. I mentioned, and we've been talking about how hard it is to get attention. It's easy to get stuck into this idea that because creating social media content can be done easily, that you should just create more and more and more. There's two problems that are associated with that. One is that in some countries do this differently, but a lot of the diplomats I've spoken to, they've expressed concerns that they need to get everything approved, so it takes forever, and then you end up spending a lot of time on something that isn't going to get a lot of attention. And it's not that it's bad, it's just it's not a productive use of your time. So James mentioned that there is a capability that we have to kind of use these social listening techniques, or an approach rather. And that's one way to kind of determine what is most useful as digital diplomats in terms of the types of content that will get attention, therefore the types of content that you should spend your time producing and distributing, and may even think about, promoting it, paying to promote it to boost some content as well, because that can be done. So what I would encourage everyone to do is to look at their social media metrics, see what types of posts are getting engagement and what isn't in different parts of the world, and record that, and make sure that when you are developing a communication strategy that you are using that evaluation, if you like. It's a social media audit. I do it with all of my university students, by the way, and some of them are going to not going to be diplomats. They're going to be working in advertising or marketing or public service. The same thing holds true for everyone. You can understand your audience a bit better by looking at what gets their attention. And typically, again, it varies greatly. I've done a lot of research on this, and in different parts of the world, it can vary a lot. But typically, the rule of thumb is audiences, or we don't really use the word audiences that much as, say, digital publics now, they will decide what they are paying attention to. They will decide what content that you're producing and posting is of use to them. They'll either find it entertaining or engaging, or most commonly, especially in certain parts of the world, what is useful. Now, the research that I've done suggests also that in media markets that are large and wealthy and are a bit older, that using social media is not going to be as effective. So compared to other countries that are, quite frankly, smaller, poorer and younger, and are kind of closer, strategically closer. So for a country like Australia, you might understand that our near neighbours who we have strong diplomatic relationships with, and I'm talking about countries like Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, certain Pacific Island nations, parts of Southeast Asia, which have younger populations but they're still quite small, so places like Cambodia, Australia and other comparable nations do very well there on social media. But compared to our embassies in places where you might think that we have a lot in common, London, Washington, New Zealand, Canada, no one's using social media to find out the information that they need. And what are they looking for? Oftentimes they're looking for information about jobs, scholarships, development aid programs, all that good, useful stuff. So my advice would be use that data that's available to do research about what was working where you are, and to try to replicate and develop that. The other thing I would suggest is that what has worked, and some countries do this better than others, but what's really worked well for ambassadors or heads of mission is that they appear on social media as people as well as representatives. Social media is oftentimes, it can be a place where you do need to present formal information on behalf of your government. So if there is a formal meeting, and oftentimes it's a photo of, let's be honest, a bunch of people in suits shaking hands in front of a sign, there might be reasons to do that, but not as many people are going to be, grabbed by that type of content. As might be I've seen some amazing videos, a great one by a former US head of mission in Hong Kong, which was done in Cantonese. It was a farewell video. It was highly personal. It was charming. He spoke Cantonese reasonably well. And here's another lesson for you. I'll tell the story, then I'll highlight the lesson. I saw this video when I was doing my research because the engagement metrics just went through the roof. And I looked at it and I thought, okay, it's great. It's really well produced. It's obviously they spent time and put some effort into it. And it's kind of cute and it's really funny. And I showed it to some students of mine who were in Hong Kong. And they just started killing themselves laughing at this. And I was like, I didn't think it was that funny. What it was I didn't understand the jokes. I was reading the subtitles, but what they were doing is they were telling jokes that were highly culturally specific. They were related to a local Hong Kong movie using like parts of a script that everyone knew. And every place has something like that you can kind of like tap into and demonstrate your connection to that local culture. And so I only understood that because my Hong Kong students I needed them to explain it to me. So that's, I guess, the rule there is try to really understand who it is that you're talking to and what it is that is going to get their attention and their engagement and be of use to them or somehow interest them.
So I think, one of the great opportunities that comes from these new tools for analysis and this media monitoring is that you can really work out where problems are developing before they've developed. So let's say there's a problem around vaccine uptake in the country that you're in as a diplomat. You can use the digital monitoring to try and understand some of the narratives within the debate, some of the gaps in knowledge, perhaps, that are leading people to reach certain conclusions, some of the problems in national debate generally around those issues. And you can use that to work through risk assessments of what the situation is in that country. And I think that's a really useful opportunity. But where it really gives you then, I think, as a diplomat, a great opportunity is that you can use that to do good, right? You can make assessments of what's happening in the public sphere of a country that you're based in, and you can contribute to a positive development within that public sphere, within that public debate. So again, if we go back to vaccines, maybe you've picked up on some narratives, maybe you're seeing some problems with accessibility to vaccines or accessibility to the right information about vaccines. And so you can make, using your network, using your convening power as an embassy, you can make a contribution to that, hopefully pushing things in the right direction. And that for me is an example of the type of thing that embassies could and should be using digital diplomacy for. So all of that insight that you can develop, all of the monitoring and understanding, it only really matters if you can use it for something good. Now, what Damien was talking about, kind of showing your connection to the local community, showing that you understand cultural references, that's great. That's very important. That helps you to build this trust as a diplomat over the span of your posting. But still, it needs to be used for something. Like, what if you're building this trust resource? What's it then for? And I think the real opportunity is in using this monitoring, using this trust that you're building up as a resource, and then identifying those things where just your country can make that contribution, where you can do good, where you see the gap, you see the opportunity, and you have that convening power, you have that network, you're able to coordinate, and it may actually mean coordinating across embassies. Because you may be seeing that actually a lot of the information about vaccines that's incorrect is coming from a neighboring country or a country on the other side of the world that speaks the same language. So maybe through coordination with the embassy there, you can also contribute to the public sphere. So I think there are so many opportunities, but I would just adding to Damien's very kind of practical points. It is also about what you use that goodwill and what you use that trust that you build up, what you use it for.
So I'd like to pick up on your point about trust, which is definitely a very important issue, especially nowadays, because we're seeing a general trend of an erosion of trust among people on government communications in general. So we also see a lot of people confusing public diplomacy with propaganda. And we're seeing that it's very prevalent nowadays. So we'd like to know from both of you, how do we distinguish, or where do we draw the line between public diplomacy and propaganda, given that the line between both, it's constantly becoming blurrier?
I've heard a few people say to me rather cynically that public diplomacy is what we do and propaganda is what they do. And there's a kernel of truth in that. A lot of the times people find justification for the way that they operate and distrust those that they see as either being just different or not part of their community, or maybe they regard them as being antagonistic in one way. But I think that's a little bit too cynical. I think there are better attempts to make distinctions between propaganda and public diplomacy that it can be reasonably made. And so let's take a few basics, right? So, I mean, one, if you're operating as a public diplomat, and I would encourage everyone out there to operate in this way, you're at least trying to be truthful as far as you can. You may make mistakes. You may not be able to give some information out or give all the information out, but your intention is not to deceive. You may be wrong, but you're not trying to deceive. Public diplomacy, especially since, over the last 20 years or so, when we've been talking about this thing called new public diplomacy, which involves more people in addition to people who are formal professional diplomats. So a wider network of people participating in diplomacy means that public diplomacy has a sense of openness, I guess, whereas propaganda, often the intention is hidden, or it may be that the origins of the information are kept secret or disguised. Another way, and there's a couple of other ways. The next two are a little bit fuzzier, but just hear me out. I guess in English, this comes down to these are English language terms, so it might not translate into everyone's first languages out there, but we'll have a crack anyway, all right? So I think there is still a difference between what we might call persuasion, which is okay, versus manipulation, which is not. Especially in open democratic societies, persuasion is required. This is the way that we try to resolve disputes, by seeking to persuade each other, or at least enough people, without having to resort to violence or some other another form of power. Manipulation has that kind of like sinister sense where you're trying to get people to do something which is not only something that they would not otherwise do, which could be good or bad, right? So persuasion can include public health campaigns, trying to get people to stop smoking or wear a seatbelt. That's persuasion, that's fine. But manipulation is trying to convince someone to do something that is not in their best interests. Yeah. So, and that's a crucial distinction to make. And I'll just close off on an attempt by the Australian government has made to kind of like enshrine this in law, to make this distinction, and you'll see how difficult it can be. So they've made a distinction between influence, which is okay, and interference, which is not. And the laws that I'm talking about are saying that it is okay for anyone, including foreign nations, to seek to influence Australia and Australians, and including how Australia is governed, what our laws are. Influence is okay. Interference is not. And again, you have to kind of understand here that interference has all those other aspects attached to it, that it is surreptitious, it is deceitful, it is manipulative, and it may include forms of dishonesty. So I guess those ways are in combination, I think, the way that I'm trying to make meaning about that distinction between the two terms.
So in a sense, Damien, what you're also trying to say is that while the face of propaganda, mostly the techniques, what the propagandists are doing, while it has remained more or less the same over the years, it has also become a little bit different because the communications landscape has become different and technology also plays a part here. Which brings us to a statement that James said during his interview with during his interview for the Public Diplomacy Handbook. James, I'd like to know a little bit more about what you said when you mentioned that a propagandist from a century ago would not feel lost in today's problems. Maybe you can tell us more about that.
Yeah, it comes from this feeling I have that actually, like, the propaganda doesn't really change. Like, the tools that you use change, but the basics of it are the same. And I think it goes to many of the points that Damien was just making. But a propagandist from 100 years ago and a propagandist today would have very similar approaches to their work. Yes, different tools. You would need to have different knowledge of how media systems work, but you would have an intent, right? You always start with the intent. If you're doing propaganda, you're working to your own interests, you're working against the best interests of the people you're targeting. That's the same. It was the same 100 years ago, it's the same now. The techniques that you would use, yes, many of the techniques have changed because the tools change. So maybe it's not all about using newspapers now as it was 100 years ago. Maybe it's not about using leaflets, but maybe it is. Maybe many of these techniques are still valid. But still, your techniques would be coercive in their nature. So they might involve a threat of force, for example. They may be manipulative. They may be covert rather than transparent. So again, 100 years ago today, same principles. You're unlikely to be using legitimate communication techniques generally. You're likely to be on the wrong side of any kind of ethical line that the majority of people in society would apply. So you're probably on the edge of breaking the rules or exploiting a tool to its kind of limits. And again, 100 years ago or even earlier, when people first started talking about public diplomacy, it meant diplomacy carried out in a transparent way, like it was an opposition to secret diplomacy. And that's still very relevant now. Propaganda is likely to be covert. Public diplomacy would be transparent, open, inclusive, truthful. So again, the principle is the same. I think 100 years ago, propaganda, if we look at some of the very authoritarian societies from 100 years ago, the propaganda was trying to build closed systems of thought, closed media systems, using high degrees of censorship. If we look at countries that are building propaganda systems domestically today, it's also pretty much the same principle there. So I stand by what I said. I think the systems are pretty much the same. The thing with communication that it all comes down to is the fact that there's only a certain number of techniques. Like, communication is communication. It doesn't matter if it was 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, or today. Yes, the tools change, the means by which you communicate change, but the basic techniques, the idea that you have an intent and a message and a way of amplifying that message, that stays the same.
So basically, the intent, that's what draws the line, or that's what differentiates public diplomacy from propaganda, considering that the tools and techniques are practically similar or the same. Now, what makes the communications environment today very much overwhelming for public diplomacy practitioners and for communication specialists in general is that there seems to be a lot of people practicing what both of you have called the dark arts of communication. So propaganda, misinformation, and the like. This is a big challenge for diplomats and for public diplomacy practitioners. How can we possibly rise above these dark arts of communications?
First, yeah, rising above the dark arts. Yeah, I think it's quite hard. It's for someone who, to be honest, people who work in diplomacy, it may be asking a bit too much for them to solve the problem of the dark arts of PR. But there's a few things that diplomats can do in concert with other aspects of the governments for whom they work, and also as part of their relationships that they build with counterparts in other countries. So for one thing, I mean, I would suggest that, and we're going to talk about tech giants a little bit later, but addressing this problem of the dark arts at the level of both regulation and of how social media companies and tech giants operate is something that many governments are seeking to do or are considering. And that is something that I think could be encouraged by people who are working in the diplomatic sphere, both within cross-government platforms, or however you're operating with other parts of your various governments, but also in terms of a kind of an international conversation about what's something that looks like a treaty or an agreement or whatever term you like to use for some kind of collective action which takes into consideration what responses are available and what responses are desirable, and also thinking about the consequences of actions against, towards content moderation, those sorts of things. There are some examples of these types of conversations happening. Obviously, the EU is one part of the world where these conversations have been going on for quite some time about regulation more generally. But one that I've been looking at recently is closer to my part of the world, which is in ASEAN, which has looked at how the ASEAN member nations should approach this problem of, what they're calling information disorder, but specifically looking at misinformation and disinformation surrounding areas or involving areas or types of conversations that have an impact on public health and public order. And I might make a distinction between the two of them, because public health has obviously arisen out of the COVID pandemic. And there is kind of like a joint statement or a movement towards jointly addressing problematic information about the pandemic and how that can be responded to. And so that's an important step towards what could be done next, which is sharing resources of ways to address this, to kind of like mitigate the undesirable impacts of misinformation, disinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic. These things are hard to do, by the way. I mean, disinformation is hard to address, but one thing that I would suggest is that if there is progress being made, we should share that progress internationally and learn from each other about best practices such that they are working. And then the other aspect of that is, I mentioned public health and public order. So in the ASEAN communiques that I've read, they're talking about public order. And that kind of like is getting into a little bit more trickier territory, because when we're talking about creating a communication environment where people feel safer, sometimes the distinction between protecting people and protecting those in power is broken down. And what we might move towards is forms of regulation which they're explained or they're sold in a way as ways to protect the nation state, protect sovereignty, and protect the social order, whereas how they are used, or in fact sometimes how they may be designed, is actually to just protect those who are in positions of political power from their political opponents. And that's something which the diplomatic community should be raising as a matter of concern. It's a straight up and down human rights concern, very similar to human rights concerns that have been part of diplomatic conversations for, well, probably at least 100 years, if not more. I'll hand over to James now and see what he has to say about these things.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think in terms of stopping the dark arts, there are a few options. I mean, the first question is like it starts with us, right? The diplomats. It's also a question of, you know, what is your intent? Are you doing something that's of mutual benefit for your country and your host country? Because I think if everyone acts in terms of mutual benefit, then you're less likely to end up straying to a more propagandist behavior. Then you've got at the tactical level, you can counter disinformation. There are toolkits. I've worked on several. I worked on the Swedish toolkit, the UK's counter disinformation toolkit. I've worked with the EU on this. You know, there's the debunking approaches. There's the pre-bunking, trying to get out ahead of some disinformation by disproving it before it even spreads widely. There's a whole host of kind of responsive and more or less fairly proactive counter techniques that you can use. But, you know, then you are at the level of messages and narratives. You're at a very kind of tactical, operational level. The trick is to counter it at the policy level, which I think is where everyone is struggling. Everyone's trying to find policy solutions to this. I think weighing up and prioritizing based on harm to the public seems to be a very good way of considering this. So, you know, issues related to health, issues related to the climate, issues that could cause someone to hurt themselves or, you know, otherwise encourage damaging behavior for public safety. You know, that's a way of designing policies that I think at least prioritize the most important things. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around norms and rules. You know, there's been a lot of talk of cyber norms, not so much around public diplomacy, propaganda, communication norms. I think we could do a lot more there. It tends to develop into discussions about regulation rather than actually getting at the normative, ethical level, which I think is probably the part that we need to address first before we go to regulation. And then finally, there's a huge policy question around the costs of being an actor who practices dark arts. How do you punish them? What do you do to them if you catch someone? How can you dissuade someone from doing this, whether it's a government or a PR company or an NGO or just an individual? What kind of costs can you bring upon someone who does this? At the moment, often it's a reputational cost. It's just shedding light on the disinformation and saying this organization did this, and hoping that embarrasses them so that they don't do it anymore. But we've had a debate within the EU for the last couple of years, sort of at EU level, about whether to ban, like whether you can use sanctions against propagandists, for example, whether you could give disinformation, whether you could sanction someone for spreading disinformation. And obviously what happened at the beginning of the Ukraine war now is that RT and Sputnik were sanctioned within the EU. And it's the first time, sort of in its modern disinformation sense, that disinformation policy has led to these kind of sanctions. So I think there'll be a lot more now around applying costs. How do you punish? How do you embarrass? How do you make sure it's more expensive to spread disinformation and be legitimate than it is to do it, so that you think twice about doing it?
And I guess because the issue is continuously evolving, then it makes it even more challenging for, you know, shapers of policy to catch up, not just to be reactive, but also to be proactive in anticipating new challenges. So shaping regulation that tries to mitigate the impact of those who practice the dark arts of communication. It's quite challenging in itself. But we would also like to know, are there any unintended consequences for these regulations, even if they are being shaped with good intent?
I might just talk a little bit about the three main kind of like regulatory approaches that are out there in the world first, because they all have their kind of like stated aims and also kind of obvious consequences that come along with them. And I'll ask everyone just to forgive me. I'm going to use just this shorthand of America and China and EU, just because they're the three biggest players. And it's just as a way, like they're not totally identified with those. But so there's a US model of regulation, which is based upon what we all understand. America has a very pro-free speech outlook on political communication, or on any kind of communication. It's there in the Constitution. So free speech and free markets means that US model, which has been a powerful advocate for an open internet, to say that we should not limit communication and so forth. That's why US laws are highly have an impact way beyond US borders, because a lot of the tech giants are based in the United States and are protected not only by the Constitution, but on two specific US laws: the Communications Decency Act, which means that they can't be held responsible for something that a third party publishes on their website, which means that Facebook can't be held accountable for something that I publish on their website. First of all, they're not considered a publisher. Defamation laws are different there, and there are other laws which say that the US courts won't enforce a defamation payment in the United States unless a comparable US court would also have afforded that defamation case. Now, that's a lot of technical stuff there, but what it means is that there's this approach to regulation in the United States which is very hands-off. And like I said, because the main tech players are from there, that tends to be the way that they operate: self-regulation of very large, powerful businesses. That's the US model. There's the China model, which is a lot more regulation. It's predicated on the idea that the state is responsible for the health and order of a society by controlling information more. And I don't need to go into that in any great length, I don't think, because everyone understands it. And then but what that means is that model is also not only powerful within China, but it's kind of being exported as an alternative to the US model. It's also associated with a powerful sense of national sovereignty. In other words, we are going to, we'll decide what is going to happen in our part of the world. That debate is happening here in Australia as well, even though we have a very different political system to China. But it's a debate that's happening in the context of American tech firms coming to Australia, and Australia trying to legislate to limit what, so we have laws that work here, even though their companies are American. And then there's the EU approach to regulation, which is this kind of rights-based approach. And James has talked a little bit about that. And he's more expert in that area as well. But so he might want to pick this up, but the distinction is that it looks at the rights of the individual rather than free speech and free enterprise, or the rights of the state, but the rights of the individual, which are associated with things like harms associated to privacy and so forth and so forth. Now, those are the three main regulatory models, but they're still in their infancy in a lot of ways. The EU is probably as advanced as any of them. They're still being worked out. And the rest of the world, and this is what I think is important, the rest of the world is trying to kind of like cobble together their version of those three approaches, or maybe coming up with an approach which is a mixture of them and maybe something else as well. Research in that area is limited because we're still at the very early stages of that. Even in an advanced economy where these discussions have been going on for a long time, and I'm talking about places like the UK and Canada and here in Australia, we're still only stepping slowly towards understanding what regulating social media or other forms of the internet actually leads to. To give an example, there was a period about a year ago here in Australia where there was a negotiation going on between Google and Facebook and the Australian government. So new laws were being proposed, which was going to insist that Facebook and Google only, none of the other big tech companies would, long story short, would have to pay news media companies for when their content is published on Facebook or Google. And for a while there, Facebook just stopped all news stories appearing on Facebook in Australia. And it was a shot across the bow. It said, like, this is what could happen. The social media companies don't have to operate here. It turned out that there was a negotiation and everything worked out in the end. But I raised that as an example of a little thing that a social media company could do. if they left in its entirety, if Facebook stopped operating in a country like Australia, it would wipe out so many small businesses. It would have a dramatic effect on the economy. That's just one consequence of going to war with, these social media giants. And I think we might be getting onto that a little bit later. That's not even taking into account some of the obvious consequences of when you are going to moderate content, how are you going to do that? And who decides what's permitted and what's okay? Defamation cases, when they reach court, they go on for months. The expectation is that a social media company might be able to make a decision more or less instantly on thousands, if not tens of thousands of potentially defamatory posts. How is that done? No one has an answer to that question yet. And that's one of the reasons why why we're still in this situation where we're going we don't really quite know what to do because we don't know what we can do. Yeah. Anyway, I've talked for quite a bit, and I'll hand over to James now.
What I'll do is take what you said. If we imagine what you said, these three models are along the x-axis. Then we have a y-axis, and I'll introduce three other layers here that apply to each of those models that you talked about, Damien. The first is you have media houses which have this traditional gatekeeper model, right? They have an editor, they have a commissioning editor who's responsible for everything that's published. They weigh up the content based on newsworthiness. And they give, a good newspaper, a good media house will give the right of reply. So they'll issue corrections if something is wrong. So there's a certain way of behaving that's been established for 150 years or more in many countries. So that's one approach. Then you have the platforms, which are new. They've been around for 10, 15, 20 years. And they're governed by their terms of service, which is their own set of rules that they decide. They decide if and when they enforce them. And it creates a lot of these problems that Damien was alluding to in terms of, when do they moderate content? Are they going to moderate this content in Germany, but they would allow it in France? Are they allowing some things in Australia that they don't allow in New Zealand, right? There's this kind of application question. But terms of service on the platforms, it's a bit like when you go into a restaurant and they say, no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? They have the right to decide who gets to eat at the restaurant, and it's up to them. It's the same with the platforms. They can decide that their own based on their own how they feel today, what kind of discussions are allowed, what kind of discussions aren't. And yes, they have very advanced policies in terms of service, but they don't actually enforce them consistently, which raises really interesting issues. But it does mean that there's this level of where they have discretion about what they allow and what they don't allow, which is very different than if we take this third level, which is governmental regulation, legal regulation, where it has to be applied evenly, right? You have to, if you're a government and you have a set of laws, you have to apply them for everybody. It can't just be for some people. You can't change one day to the next depending on how you feel, or whether you're busy. The law is the law, and it has to be applied consistently. The reason I've sort of introduced these three levels is that there's a really interesting interplay between them. And I think that's the part, when we're looking at the three models that Damien laid out, that's the part I want to get into, is how these three additional layers, I'm sorry to get so complicated, but how they feed into this problem. Because if you're let's say you're in the EU, the legal basis is your fundamental freedoms. So freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom to privacy, those kind of questions. That's what inspires this very high up legal overarching level. Then you have the platforms with their terms of service, and those terms of service can be the same everywhere. They can create these. They create a policy for social harm. They create a policy for coordinated inauthentic behavior. They decide. But in an ideal world, we would want the terms of service to be inspired by fundamental freedoms, right? We would want them to be an adaptation of some kind of legal basis. But at the moment, they're mainly derived from the American system. And then we have the media houses whose content often ends up on the platforms. And what we're seeing with them is this interplay between the established media houses who have the right of reply, who use newsworthiness as their judgment, who have gatekeepers who are keeping the standards high, and alternative media houses who are new, they are disruptive, they perhaps don't meet the same standards, they perhaps don't have real journalists, maybe they're more politically engaged. And so the way they play out on these platforms, both in relation to the law and in relation to terms of service, adds this additional layer of complication. What it all means is we have three systems, we have three layers within those systems, and we have no norms, we have no clear ethical guidance that can tell us, here's what we should be doing. Here's a model that would work for most countries. Here's a model that would work in Western democratic, liberal democracies. Here's a model that would work in more authoritarian countries. We don't have any of that. All we have is these three layers that are just clashing without any real clarity about how to solve it. So those in the audience, if you have any ideas, it's talk about opportunities. It's all there for you to come in and revolutionize this whole field.
So James, with how you described it, it occurred to me that it feels more like a jungle. Everyone, different sectors, different governments, different places, they're operating independently, trying to address whatever issues are specific to them and are also encompassing, the rest of the world in their own way. So given that this is how reality looks like today with the communications and media environment, when we add the diplomats and public diplomacy practitioners into the mix, then it becomes even a little bit more complicated, given that our role as diplomats, it's quite borderless in a sense. The work is rotating and we move to different places. So with this, we would like to know what kind of technical skills, what kind of knowledge, expertise, and what kind of attitude should our public diplomacy practitioners today possess in order to, rise above these challenges and to use these new tools to their advantage?
I might just veer away from the dark arts for the moment and just talk about what public diplomacy can look like, or what's required to be, a good public diplomat in a digital era. The skills and the technical skills are, I mentioned before, accessibility to the internet is one thing. Forms of digital literacy and creative literacy are another thing. And it's actually easier now than I probably ever has been to produce reasonably high quality media content. With a little bit of effort, you can turn something that's, your posts into something that looks good, is going to have some movement, some color and motion, something that is at least appearing interesting. So I would encourage people to avail themselves of those tools and put a little bit of an effort into making it look good. But even more important than that, the old standard skills still apply, right? Are still required. Storytelling works great, right? If you can turn your information into a narrative that has a character that engages people not only intellectually but also emotionally and even imaginatively, right? Telling a story is a wonderful skill to develop. And storytelling is a technique. We don't think about it often as a technique, but in terms of technical skills, being able to tell a story well is a technique that's worth developing. Earlier on, both James and I have mentioned this idea of listening, of monitoring, of availing ourselves of the information that's available about what people are talking about. That I can't overemphasize that, I should say. There's a lot of simple tools and a little bit more complicated tools, which can look at everything from basic social media metrics to quite in-depth network analysis of not only the people on social media, but also how information is clustered and how it moves through social media. And if you have the chance to, do some education along those lines, do it. I would encourage anyone who's in a position to ask for professional development resources, time and money within your ministry to consider some of those things, training in not only media production, but let's call it media analysis, social network analysis. And but the most important thing I would suggest for any public diplomat is to have a sense of what a communication strategy looks like. And a strategy has a purpose and has, if you like, a target or a public or a community in mind. Why are you doing what you're doing? And if you're not thinking about what is the strategic purpose of everything that you're producing in terms of content, then you're more than likely wasting your time and going to feel disappointed because nothing really comes of it. James, before when I told the story about the consul general was in Hong Kong who did this beautiful video, and James quite rightly said that he'd developed all this trust, but what was he going to do with it? What's the point of it? If there is no point to your public diplomacy, then maybe you should think about why you're bothering. If that's what strategy is. So I do that with all my students all the time. We talk about strategy, and in fact, they get sick of me talking about it. I go blue in the face, just repeating strategy, strategy, strategy. Have a purpose, and hopefully that purpose will be achievable and measurable. That's tricky, and also ethical, right? The right thing to do, as well as something that can be done.
Yeah, I will add. I'll split it into two things. There's the essential things, and then there's the things that would be good, that would be nice. And I think on the essential side, a public diplomat needs the skills to listen. You already said this, Damien, but it goes into there's one part of that's a social skill. There's another part that's a social listening skill, right? An analytical skill. So learning how to listen from personal contacts, from meeting with journalists, meeting with members of the public, your normal contacts, but then also having those same skills developed in terms of using software that teaches you about the online debate. So those listening skills, and this software is very accessible. It's cheap. It's not a huge investment in time to learn. Not really. You don't need to have this brand watch that costs tens of thousands of dollars. It's enough to use some of the free tools, TweetDeck, BuzzSumo. You can get enough information from this, but you need to learn how to use them. And also, as Damien said, another essential thing is to have foreign policy priorities. Now, it may sound strange to say it, but I've come across foreign ministries that don't actually have objectives still. That's the way it is. Not all foreign ministries, not all embassies have a developed way of establishing priorities, objectives, strategies. But you need that. That's essential. That's. I don't think anyone will tell you otherwise. I know it sounds really boring, but an essential part of the public diplomat's task is official notifications. Like a minister comes to visit, they meet with the local host government. They're going to have to communicate about that. It's quite dull. It's not really very interesting for many people, probably most of it anyway. But can you create storytelling around that? Can you do it? Can you package it in the best possible way, using videos, using images, using interesting narratives? And also essential is understanding your audience. It also goes back to the listening part, but actually understanding the segments in your host society and how to access them through influencers, through mediators, through individuals and organizations who have access to those audiences and are credible to them. So that's at the essential level. Then there's the level of what would be nice, what would be good. And of course, it's those things that we were talking about before. So building trust, having a visible presence, being a face to a name, being a face to the embassy, having that cultural connection, engaging in dialogue, being inclusive towards civil society groups who are engaged in certain issues. Those are all of the skills that a diplomat should have, and it's important. But again, it all comes down to what's it for, what are the essential things. So I'll leave it there. I think we're in agreement, Damien. I think we agree.
Moving on to the next part of our webinar, we have some questions from our participants, Damien and James. And I'd like to go for the first question. Is there such a thing as a public diplomacy effort that can eventually turn into propaganda? Something that is initially intended as a means to public diplomacy, but eventually transforms into propaganda?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts about this. The short answer is yes, it can. It can slide from one to the other. Certainly, it can slide from public diplomacy into propaganda. And this is true of any kind of form of communication that seeks to influence or persuade. And it's not only diplomats, but advertising is notorious for it. So are political campaigns, even civil society organizations and NGOs, which is where I started, actually, where I cut my teeth working for international human rights and environmental NGOs. And I'll confess, I found it difficult to reconcile it when I needed to I needed the right result, but the communication strategy included, shall we say, some ethical questions remained. I'll tell you a little bit more. So I conducted a campaign where I presented things in a certain way, left some information out, didn't lie, but inferred that things were one way where they weren't really that way, and so forth. And did so for, it was poor communication ethics, but it was a good environmental outcome. So the question is, when is it okay to be slightly unethical to get an ethical outcome, and that comes along, and there's no easy way to answer that. And I'm sure that people will be confronted with this. The part of the way towards answering that is to think long term, to think about what are the ongoing long-term consequences of being, I want to say unethical, but not fully ethical. I guess. So there's a price that can be paid in terms of trust. There is also, there's this other slightly grey area, which is sometimes called nudging, which is a way of communicating rather surreptitiously for what's meant to be a good purpose. And what's troubling about it is that it's not open, it's not overt. It's a way of trying to persuade people or somehow even manipulate them to do something that is, well, it's in their best interest. The classic example of this is certain types of, like, painting arrows on a road and bringing them closer together makes people slow down their car. Right, so it's operating on a psychological level, so therefore it's not part of an open debate. And that, but is that bad? Is that good? So there's these horrible kind of like in between areas. There's also sometimes when acting in the national interests means that you are required to, ordered to, instructed to do things that you might not otherwise do. That's where public diplomacy edges towards the type of communication that is used by militaries, which is often called strategic communication or information operations, or gets very close to propaganda. And sometimes that line, it's hard to make that distinction.
I'll just add, because I think you covered quite a lot of issues there, but I'll just add, often it can come down to the quality of debate, like the quality of the information sphere where the public diplomacy is taking place. Because if it's highly polarized, you can be doing public diplomacy with the best intentions, you can have your objectives that may be mutually beneficial, but in a deeply polarized debate, people start to kind of fight against each other. They become very entrenched in their positions. maybe they start trolling, maybe the quality of discussion drops. And I've certainly seen examples of where even good causes end up in this horrible debate of just us against them. Whatever news comes up that we think supports us, we use. Whatever they think supports them, they use. And there's no quality of discussion anymore. There's no quality of dialogue. And I think that leads us towards these kind of closed systems of thought where you're kind of stuck. You're either or. You're either with us or against us. And that's a good example of something that seems to happen all the time on particularly on Twitter, where just the quality of debate breaks down. And I think that can bring your public diplomacy closer to propaganda.
And we have another question. So, can public diplomacy be used by a state to negatively influence another state? I think we've touched on this a little bit a while ago. The participant also has a follow-up question. That is also considered strategic communications, isn't it?
Yeah, the short answer to both those questions is yes and yes, and it does happen. There are, and I don't really want to name the countries. People can fill in the blank for themselves, but there are some countries which have used social media and digital diplomacy, including the accounts of recognizable senior members of the foreign ministry to well, it's a version of trolling to kind of like attack or to seek a response from another country. Trolling, by the way, just in case, it's worth mentioning this, I think. So trolling is a term that's related to phishing. It means to try to get a response. So it's using a post as bait. You're baiting another country, and the idea is you want them to take the bait. So you could say something that is provocative, offensive, and the aim is to perhaps escalate an issue or to define a relationship between the two countries in ways that are less than friendly. Sometimes diplomacy serves to do that, to frame a relationship between countries as being as cooling rather than warming, and social media can be used for those purposes.
Yeah, as Damien says, there are plenty of examples we could use of countries using their social media accounts, MFAs or embassies to troll one another. I think it's beneath the dignity of the institution of diplomacy. I think that diplomacy and diplomats should try to stand somehow above the events of today and try and show that there is a consistency of relations that will continue regardless of what's happening between two countries. And because we need to live together, right? Our neighbors are not going to disappear. They're going to be with us for hundreds, hopefully thousands of years. So we need to have this long-term, not neutrality, but dignity, I think, that I would love to see in public diplomacy. And I think, it's not just one country. There are plenty that are being dragged into this game thinking that they're being clever and edgy and that it's somehow giving them some extra credibility in the online debate. And it really isn't. I think it's a very sad development for diplomacy.
Can I just add one thing there? And I guess one thing that for diplomats to think about is how to respond when you are trolled. And the expression is, don't feed the trolls. And it's certainly a mistake that I've seen recently is when a national leader has come out to respond to a piece of trolling content that's appeared on social media. And I thought that was ill-advised in terms of the diplomatic relationship. It may have had domestic political benefits because sometimes it's useful for a national leader to demonstrate that they are taking up a fight on behalf of their nation, but I don't think it served a diplomatic purpose. And I thought it diminished both the relation, damaged the relationship and diminished the position.
Indeed, that's something, diplomats and other public officials have to confront and have to live with, the trolls and, of course, the negative comments. So we have a third question here, Damien and James. How can those involved in public communications fight disinformation at the grassroots level?
Oh, James, I think you should go first this time, given the work that you've done on several reports on this.
Yeah, so I mean, so I've been working on the kind of toolkit. So I wrote worked with the team writing the UK Foreign Office's toolkit and the Swedish Foreign Ministry and government's toolkits. And it begins, I think, with the facts always. Fact checking is one of those most basic tools. What are the actual facts here, and figuring out. Then you go from there. Well, how do we best counteract it? And one way to look at it is that disinformation can consist of messages, narratives, and brands. So at the level of messages, someone says something that's false, and you can correct that with the truth. So they say something is black, you say no, it's white, right? And you correct that, and that's straightforward. If you're seeing collections of messages around a certain issue, usually that builds into a narrative. A narrative is just a piece of storytelling. But usually if you're seeing lots of messages about the effectiveness of a vaccine from a certain country, there's probably a narrative there about that country's ability to create a vaccine. And so you can also engage with it at the level of narrative. You can decide not to answer those messages, not to correct them. Instead, we're gonna address this narrative and try and find ways of replacing it with our own narrative, or otherwise finding ways of correcting an untruthful narrative. But then I think even more important is at this level of the brand, which is where if you're seeing lots of narratives collecting around a certain issue, usually it means that there are actors there who are assuming a certain identity and a certain set of values. And they're out there pushing these narratives to achieve a set of goals that they have. And if you can identify who they are, what they say they stand for, and what they're doing, you can counteract them at the level of the brand. So it's called counter-brand strategy. And what you might do is look for hypocrisy in what they're doing. Maybe they say that they stand for something, but actually their behavior says that they're doing something else. Maybe the narratives that they're using are actually being used cynically. Maybe it's not at all what they really stand for. Maybe their values don't quite add up, or maybe they're doing other things in other parts of the world where their values don't add up. Or maybe the people they're speaking to, the people that they're trying to influence, are people whose interests are not at all served by being in partnership with that actor. So acting at the counter-brand level it's another way of trying to basically discredit some disinformation. And then there's a sort of fourth level, which is even higher, which is countering the intent. And if you understand a threat actor very well, and you understand what you think their intent towards you is, you can say, well, we're not going to engage with the messages. We're not even going to engage with the narratives, or we're not going to try and discredit them. We're not going to engage with any of this. We're only interested in their intent. They have a certain intent that we know they're trying to achieve. So we're going to counteract them at that level. And that may mean policy level changes, or it may mean behind the scenes diplomacy or track 2 diplomacy, or it may mean, your head of state contacting them. But, that's another way of thinking about it. So you have kind of 4 layers. And as a diplomat, all of those layers are accessible to you. But it's a question of what you think serves you best. Should we correct the disinformation at the level of the message? Should we deal with the narrative? Should we deal with the brand identity? Or should we deal with the overall intent of the threat actor?
For a final question for this session, this is very interesting. The participant is asking, faced with the worst issues, like a crisis, for example, do officials always have to proactively engage with the public? Or does acting with dignified silence prove useful too at certain times? For example, not responding to trolls or negative comments or hate speech in social media. What are your thoughts on this?
So when I was working on the UK toolkit, one of the big things that I needed to do was develop a way of figuring out when to be silent, because everyone feels like they have to respond. You see some disinformation, we have to respond, particularly at the political level. If your minister sees some disinformation about them, they always say, you have to do something, you have to respond. So how do you develop a way of deciding when to respond and when not to respond? And so what we did was develop a small kind of thinking tool, like a way of working through risk, to basically say, well, what is the risk of this to the public? What is the risk of it to our objectives? And then what is the size of reach? So something that's high risk to the public, but only 2 people are seeing, you probably don't need to respond to it. You can follow it, you can track it, you can develop some lines to take maybe, but you probably wouldn't respond because only 2 people are seeing it, and probably more people would see your response. Again, something that has no harm but reaches lots of people. Do you really need to respond to it? Maybe the public can correct this themselves, right? Maybe there's enough people out there who are going to just correct the false information. The real, that it's that area of in between where there's a high risk of public harm or harm to your objectives or harm to something else that you see as important, and reach, where you see a risk of those 2 things, kind of meeting in the middle, and that's where you would respond. But in many cases, actually, what's helpful, I think, to diplomats is seeing a way for them to argue actually to their bosses, we don't need to respond.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly, in a practical sense, what we're talking about is risk management and crisis management. And generally what we're talking about is trying to prevent risks from turning into crises. If you, in your communications teams, if you haven't given any thought to doing so, you should consider developing a risk matrix and also a series of actions that you should take. And when you things that are routine, someone posts something that can be easily corrected on your social media feed and you can just go and do it, that's fine. But when do you need to escalate to a higher decision-making body because the risk's getting higher, and certainly how to avert risk turning into crisis, and what happens when crisis comes along? That means normally, you're in a meeting with the ambassador or the CEO or whoever it is. So being prepared and understanding what are the different risks, the different level of risks, and therefore what your response should be. And very practically, there should be a document that lays that out for everyone who's operating in these circumstances.
Damien and James, it's been a very insightful session with this panel discussion. And I guess one thing that we would like to share with the participants is that although we've discussed a lot about the risks that come with new technology, the new communications environment, this panel discussion isn't about scaring them or making them afraid to take risks when it comes to communication and public diplomacy. In fact, it is the opposite. By talking about these risks and emerging problems and issues that come with this new communications environment, the goal really is to encourage all of us, diplomats, public diplomacy practitioners, communicators, all of us, to try to find new ways, to explore new innovative ways to overcome these challenges and to really rise above the noise, the current noise in the communications environment. We hope that you learned a lot from this session. This is the final activity in the ASEF Public Diplomacy Training Program. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Damien and James for sharing with us so many things that we need to prepare for and that we need to brace for as diplomats, as public diplomacy practitioners in today's very complicated and very challenging times. So to all of you, thank you so much for participating. Have a good day, have a good afternoon, have a good evening, everyone.